Hey everybody, in the intro to this video I give the wrong number to what this video is going to be listed as on YouTube. The last chapter was actually chapter 16. This is chapter 17. That's how it's going to be listed, 17 out of 19 on the channel. Thank you so much. Sorry for the error. Hey everybody. This is chapter 6 of part 2 of Gustav A. Vetter's Dialectical Materialism, a Historical and Systematic Survey. Chapter 6 of part 2 is titled The Dialectical Materialist Theory of Knowledge. I'm going to put this up on the YouTube channel under the title of chapter 16 for purposes of having more interesting information than part 1 and part 2 in the description, which if you don't know, if you've never made a YouTube video before, the space that you have for a title is rather limited. So anyway, chapter 6, the Dialectical Materialist Theory of Knowledge. If we recall the two aspects which Engels attributes to, quote, the great basic question of all philosophy, end quote, the problem of the relation between thought and being, it will be seen that all our discussions hitherto have been concerned with the first of these, the problem of priority, the question which is primary in the temporal sense, thought or being, spirit or nature. All the tenets of dialectical materialism are so far dealt with, have had no other object than to demonstrate the priority of being or, quote, matter, and to do so within the framework of a general theory of being, a general ontology. We must now address ourselves to the second aspect of the relation between thought and being, namely to the question of whether our thinking is capable of apprehending the real world, or in other words, to the dialectical materialist epistemology. The problem of knowledge is the main problem of philosophy to this extent that its solution is logically prerequisite for the further solution of the ontological problem. The question, that is, as to the nature of the world and of reality generally. Mitten doubtless has this situation in mind when he urges against the radical opponents of philosophy that all positive science presupposes an answer to the question whether the world it investigates is independent of our thinking or itself a product of thought, and hence that all positive science is founded upon a theory of the potentialities of thought. In spite of this, the Soviet accounts of dialectical materialism choose the opposite path and deal with the ontological problem before the epistemological one. This is no less true of the earlier accounts, Mitten, Ratasevich, and then of the latter, Leonov, Alexandrov. Nor is this merely a matter of purely external priority and spatial arrangement, but rather of a logical priority, in that the dialectical materialist treatment of the problem of knowledge already presupposes in principle the presence of an objective reality independent of consciousness. Several authors actually make express declaration to this effect. Obichkin, for instance, who opens his account of the dialectical materialist theory of knowledge with the formal announcement, quote, the Marxist-Leninist epistemology is based on an acknowledgement of the existence of an external material world independent of human consciousness, end quote. G. Obichkin. A similar assumption also underlies the historicism on which Soviet authors lay great emphasis in dealing with epistemology, and which is exemplified in their fundamental insistence that epistemological problems must be approached from a historical point of view. It is the business of dialectical materialism to investigate the way in which the knowledge of social man has come to maturity, to show how in the course of centuries his knowledge of the world has increasingly perfected itself in keeping with the progressive development of the means of production. As to the method of this dialectical materialist approach to epistemology, we may make the following brief remarks at this point. It is undoubtedly true that from a position of genuine universal doubt, the epistemological inquiry cannot be set in motion at all, and that such an inquiry cannot be conducted in advance. Quote, before any concrete knowledge has been obtained, but only in the context of the concrete act of knowing itself. There may also be something to be said for the placing of epistemology after ontology, but to set up an external world independent of the knowing subject as the starting point to epistemological inquiry is to take for granted the very point to be proved. The first aspect of the question as to the relation of thought and being, namely as to the temporal and genetic priority of matter over consciousness, has already served as the topic of our whole previous discussion. In particular, we have seen from the preceding chapter how dialectical materialism actually conceives of the emergence of consciousness from matter in the course of the evolutionary process. In spite of this, we must first of all return in the opening pages of the present chapter to some subsidiary philosophical problem which are bound up with this first aspect of Engels' quote, great basic question of all philosophy, end quote. The latter sections deal with the second part of the relation between thought and being, namely the properly epistemological question whether consciousness is or is not capable of reflecting being aright. The priority of matter over consciousness, the first aspect of the question at issue, is settled by dialectical materialism to the effect that matter is primary in respect to its origins, and that consciousness only arises later from matter. As we have seen, the general philosophical justification for this claim is supposed to be provided by the laws of the materialist dialectic. In addition to this, the Soviet philosophers also proffer a number of more concrete explanations to account for the emergence of life, whose activities differ so markedly from the behavior of inorganic matter, and more particularly for the appearance of sensation and consciousness. Thus, we are already familiar with the explanation given for the emergence of life from inorganic matter. The physico-chemical reactions of inanimate matter already harbored the possibility of serving as a basis for the occurrence of vital processes. In the course of an immensely long process of evolution, these possibilities were necessarily actualized one by one. There is no need for any further return to the subject here. The same principle is enlisted to explain the origin of sensation. Quote, inorganic matter contains the possibility of the emergence of sensitive and hence of thinking beings. But this possibility only becomes actual at a definite stage in the historical development of matter, end quote. F.I. Kaskachik. Lenin sees the potential presence of sensation and hence of consciousness in inanimate matter in its capacity for, quote, reflection, in the physical sense of mirroring, which in one form or another is characteristic of all matter. Quote, sensation in the psychological sense he regards as, quote, the transformation of the energy of external excitation into a state of consciousness, end quote. In this form it is typical only of the higher organisms, but something of the kind is already to be found even in the lower forms of material existence, namely reflection in the physical sense. Quote, in its well-defined form, sensation is associated only with the higher forms of matter, organic matter, while, quote, in the foundation of the structure of matter, end quote, one can only surmise the existence of a faculty akin to sensation, end quote. Quote, but it is logical to assert that all matter possesses a property which is essentially akin to sensation, the property of reflection, end quote. Sensation and consciousness, therefore, are not formally inherent in matter of lower order. They are merely the outcome of certain rudiments present in it, which have still to undergo a series of, quote, qualitative changes, the theory of a kind of universal animation of matter, such as was developed by Plekhanov, who claimed to discern a sort of consciousness, albeit in varying degrees, within all matter, and who said that, quote, even a stone thinks, end quote, is therefore rejected as hylozoism, end quote. M.B. Mitten. If we now inquire as to the specific peculiarity of consciousness, the highest form of, quote, reflection, whether at the level of sensation or of thought, the explanations we receive are distinctly vague. It consists in the ability of such matter to, quote, perceive, to, quote, mirror internally, end quote, to reflect, to, quote, bring to consciousness, end quote, the processes occurring inside and outside itself. Objective physiological processes are accompanied in our nerve centers by their inner subjective expression, which takes the form of consciousness. That which in itself is an objective material process is at the same time, for a being equipped with a brain, a subjective mental act. This mental act may well be inseparably associated with the objective process occurring in the nervous system, but is not identical with it. In adopting this view of the psychophysical relationship, dialectical materialism approximates in a certain sense to the quote, double aspect theory end quote, of Fechner, who regarded mental and physical as having the same relation to one another as the concave and convex aspects of the circumference of a circle, which are one and the same, but differently perceived according to whether the observer is located inside or outside the circle. How nearly this theory approaches the position of Soviet dialectical materialism was plainly evident in its day in the work of the Debornist Bykovsky. Quote, physical and mental are one and the same process, only seen from two different sides, ... That which is seen from the outer, objective side as a physical process is equally perceived from within by the material being itself as a phenomenon of will or sensation, as mental in character, end quote. But the same viewpoint is also echoed in Stalin's formulation of material monism, to which Antonov appeals in the course of the controversy about the subject matter of psychology. Quote, a single and indivisible nature expressed in two different forms, material and ideal, end quote. Within the phenomenon of consciousness, dialectical materialism sets up a further, quote, qualitative distinction, end quote, between animal and human consciousness. In the previous chapter, we have made the acquaintance of Pavlov's theory, according to which human mental activity is to be distinguished from animal by the fact that in man the second signaling system is superimposed upon the first. This implies on the one hand a certain kinship between human and animal, quote, higher nervous activity, end quote, but on the other also an essential superiority of the human over the animal. Initially, this argues some degree of continuity between the two. Engels believed himself to have found evidence in animals of every kind of intellectual activity, induction and deduction, and hence also abstraction, as he fancied, for example, that his dog Dido must possess generic concepts, since she was certainly able to distinguish quadrupeds from bipeds, analysis of unknown objects, the cracking of nuts, synthesis, the methodical performance of, quote, artful tricks, end quote, by animals, and experiment in new situations and difficult circumstances. In all these cases, it seemed to him that the workings of the animal understanding were similar in type to the human and differed merely in degree or accomplishment. Only the dialectical activity of reason, in Engels' opinion, is solely confined to man. Soviet scientists consider that they have found the makings of intellect among the more highly developed anthropoid apes. These are capable of reaching a food target not directly accessible by alternative roundabout routes, and even of employing various objects as, quote, tools in doing so. Lady Gina Kotz claims to have detected, quote, primary abstraction, end quote, among chimpanzees and their ability to separate color properties from those of shape and size. Soviet philosophy is nevertheless adamant on the point that all these manifestations of the animal mind represent only the, quote, prehistory of the human intellect. A, quote, essential, quote, qualitative difference continues always to lie between the two. Quote, when we see an ape going in search of the stick it requires and then using it a moment later to secure the bait, we are inclined to interpret this procedure as a rudimentary stage of that behavior which later, in a qualitatively new form is characteristic of man in the deliberate pursuit of a definite goal, end quote. N.Y. Voitonis. Soviet philosophy agrees in the first place with Engels in finding the most essential distinction between the human and animal intellect in the fact that only the human understanding is capable of dialectical thought, and this because the latter presupposes, quote, investigation of the nature of concepts themselves, end quote. Friedrich Engels. On this question of animal mentality, dialectical materialism differs equally from the school of those who, like Thorndike and others, discount even the rudiments of consciousness in animals, and from those who, like Kuhler, attempt to explain animal behavior by postulating a consciousness akin to the human. The first because it leads to a denial of the genetic connection between animal and human consciousness, and is compelled accordingly to regard the emergence of human consciousness as a real, quote, miracle. The second because it obliterates the qualitative boundaries between animal mind and human consciousness. If dialectical materialism is thus to be found defending the thought and consciousness of man against identification with the animal mind, it is a great deal sharper still in its opposition to the, quote, vulgar materialist and, quote, identification of thought and matter. Parenthesis, Buchner, Vogt, Moleschott, and already in the 18th century the physician Cabanis, and parenthesis, to Vogt's opinion that thought stands in the same relation to the brain as bile to the liver, or to Buchner's attempt in his book Force and Matter to reduce thought to the physico-chemical motions in the brain, Marxist philosophical materialism replies that though thought may certainly be derived from matter, thought cannot be reduced or assimilated thereto in any such primitive fashion. Engels writes in the Dialectics of Nature, quote, one day we shall certainly, quote, reduce, and, quote, thought experimentally to molecular and chemical motions in the brain, but does that exhaust the essence of thought, end quote. Engels. Dialectical materialism undoubtedly believes thought to be a product of matter, not in the sense of a material secretion, however, but rather as a special property of highly organized matter, viz. The brain. Thought is one of those properties of matter which cannot be dealt with by the ordinary methods of material measurement. The brain is admittedly extended in three-dimensional space, but thoughts and feelings, quote, have neither length nor breadth, neither thickness nor height, end quote. Yet dialectical materialism is in no way tempted by this into acceptance of spiritual substance as such. Quote, even though thought and consciousness may exhibit an ideal, spiritual character, they are nevertheless phenomena of the one material world and have no existence as substances in their own right, end quote. I. Andreev. We have already referred in the previous chapter to the role of labor in the transition from ape to man, but in addition to labor, a decisive significance for the development of human consciousness is also attributed in Soviet thinking to language. Language is as old as consciousness and, like the latter, a product of social life, but both arise simultaneously in the course of the labor process. Language is an embodiment of thought. Thought and language form a unity, though they are not identical. Quote, language and thought are as intimately bound up together as form and content, and it is just as impossible to sever them as it is to separate a form from its content, end quote. I. Andreev. This unity of thought and word is also referred to by Stalin in the course of his letters on linguistics. There he expressly rejects the possibility that thoughts could arise without words. Quote, it is said that thoughts arise in the mind of man prior to their being expressed in speech, that they arise without linguistic material, without linguistic integument, in, so to say, a naked form. But that is absolutely wrong. Whatever thoughts arise in the human mind, and at whatever moment, they can arise and exist only on the basis of the linguistic material, on the basis of language, terms, and phrases. Bare thoughts free of the linguistic material, free of the, quote, natural matter, end quote, of language, do not exist. Quote, language is the immediate reality of thought, end quote, Marx. The reality of thought is manifested in language. Only idealists can speak of thinking not being connected with the, quote, natural matter, end quote, of language, of thinking without language, end quote. Stalin. Directed against Mar, these words of Stalin's are to some extent at variance with the traditional Marxist theory of, quote, hand language, end quote, and give rise to certain difficulties in accounting for the thought of deaf mutes. So far as hand language, the, quote, language of gesture, end quote, is concerned, Stalin does not directly deny the possibility of its existence, but Stalin nonetheless sees in spoken language the sole language of human society, capable of, quote, serving as an adequate means of intercourse between people, end quote. History does not know of a single human society without spoken language. Gesture and spoken language, according to Stalin, are not as incomparable as are the primitive wooden hoe and the modern caterpillar tractor with its 5-furrow plow or tractor row drill. And he attempts to neutralize the counter-argument about the thought of deaf mutes by maintaining that in cases of this type, the linguistic basis is replaced by another basis of an equally concrete and sensory kind. Quote, the thoughts of deaf mutes arise and can exist only on the basis of the images, sensations, and conceptions they form in everyday life, on the objects of the outside world and their relations among themselves, thanks to the senses of sight, of touch, taste, and smell. Apart from these images, sensation, and conceptions, thought is empty, is deprived of all content, that is, it does not exist, end quote. I. Andreev. In thus emphasizing the unity of thought and language, dialectical materialism makes a particular stand against the views of Russell and the semantic school. In regard to this topic of language, it may also be noted that Stalin's essay titled Marxism and Problems of Linguistics, on which this theory is chiefly based, is still cited as a foremost authority even in the most recent Soviet publications. The dialectical materialist theory of the origins of life and consciousness has many advantages over the ordinary materialist view on this subject. A particular point in its favor is that it acknowledges the essential difference between life and inorganic matter, as also that between human thinking and the animal mind. Despite this, however, dialectical materialism still retains the untenable conception of a genetic emergence of the higher spheres, life and consciousness, from the lower. It must be particularly stressed in this connection that Soviet philosophy itself admits that, for the moment at least, this hypothesis has been scientifically proved. The vague, quote, confirmations on the part of science that we have recounted from time to time are very far from constituting conclusive proofs, nor are they regarded as such either by Soviet philosophy or Soviet science. The dialectical philosophers are compelled to admit of every single, quote, dialectical transition to a higher order of some kind, that this transition has, quote, not yet, end quote, been scientifically demonstrated. Leonov concedes this of the transition from inorganic to living matter in the following terms, quote, as the natural sciences develop, ideas as to the ways and means whereby life is originated from inorganic nature are liable to change, and are in fact doing so. But the truth of the teaching of Marxist philosophical materialism remains beyond all doubt, that at some time or other in the remote past, life must have arisen from non-living matter, from inanimate structures in nature, on the basis of the natural laws of their development, without the intervention of any forces of an immaterial, spiritual, or, quote, divine character, unquote. M.A. Leonov. As for the spontaneous emergence of matter equipped with sensation, it is Lenin himself who confesses this claim unproved when he allows that further investigation is needed as to, quote, how matter apparently entirely devoid of sensation is related to matter, which, though composed of the same atoms or electrons, is yet endowed with a well-defined faculty of sensation. Materialism clearly formulates the as yet unsolved problem and thereby stimulates the attempt to solve it, to undertake further experimental investigation, end quote. Lenin. The same is true of the transition to consciousness, quote, inasmuch as the materialist dialectic assigns consciousness to the general category of reflection, it confronts natural science eo ipso with the still unsolved problem as to how the highest form of motion and reflection in matter, that of consciousness, has emerged concretely from the motion and reflection of its lower forms. End quote. V. Raltsevich. The sole basis of this thesis of the spontaneous ascent from the lower to the higher, therefore, resides in the philosophical theory of dialectical materialism, especially the principle of the transition from quantitative into qualitative change, but we do not need to go any further into this here. More particularly so far as concerns the appeal to the, quote, double aspect theory, end quote, which is supposed to bridge the gap between matter and consciousness. The analogy between the concave and convex side of a mirror offers no solution, for there the difference in the images produced remains within the common field of optical reflection, and exhibits no such essential distinctions as those between wave motion, say, and the abstract idea of justice. We need not linger here on the question whether human thought is essentially different from mind in animals, for Soviet dialectical materialism denies this difference as little as we do. The point on which our criticism must fasten is again the claim that human thought and consciousness are genetically derived from animal cognition. It is easy to maintain that apes were transformed into men when they first began using tools for purposes of labor. But the real question is how the ape could ever possibly have come to use tools on his own account, i.e., to employ means to an end which did not yet exist and could be grasped only in intention through intellectual activity. For natural history shows us that when animals are left to themselves, they make no progress. The first apes appear in the Oligocene? I don't know if I'm saying that right. Some 10 million years ago. Some 10 million years have passed since then, and the apes have displayed not the smallest symptoms of progress. Man, on the other hand, first appeared in quaternary times, and in the relatively short period that has since elapsed, he has made the enormous cultural advance from extreme primitivism to the position he occupies today. If Voitonus, as we saw earlier, had such difficulty in introducing the ape to the most elementary use of tools, and if he soon encountered an impassable barrier in doing so, how then can our, quote, forebears be supposed to have arrived at once and unaided, not only as using tools, but as seeking them out for themselves or even manufacturing them? To this the Soviet philosophers will reply that the apes were compelled by climatic changes and the resultant steppe conditions in Central Africa to descend from the trees and to seek their food on level ground, this being connected with the transition to an upright posture and the subsequent changes in skull structure and enlargement of the brain, which gradually led to the formation of intellectual capacities. But against this it must be urged that, once on the ground, Australopithecus would have found himself, as the Soviet authors themselves admit, under very difficult living conditions, having lost the rich store of vegetable sustenance previously available in plenty among the treetops. He would have had to depend on roots without possessing limbs equipped for digging them, and resort to a meat diet without having the speed to compete with the beasts of prey. All this would have compelled him to employ implements of various kinds, but the formation of intellectual capacities, whereby alone he could become capable of making and using such tools, would be dependent on extremely gradual changes in his physique. This again could only have come about after a very long period of time, but by then the luckless Australopithecus would long since have perished under the new and difficult circumstances of his environment. It must therefore be insisted that it is not the use of tools that creates the intellect, but on the contrary that it is the already existing intellect which is capable of devising means for the realizing of an ideal not yet existent but already anticipated goal. Section 2, the quote, copy theory. The foregoing discussions have shown us how dialectical materialism thinks of the priority of matter over knowledge in concrete terms. But in order to be a materialist, it is not enough to acknowledge this priority on the part of matter. One must also think it possible for matter to be known. The knowability of matter constitutes the second aspect of the problem as to the relation of thought and being. Stalin formulates this position in the following terms, quote, contrary to idealism, which denies the possibility of knowing the world and the world's laws, which does not believe in the authenticity of our knowledge, does not recognize objective truth, and holds that the world is full of, quote, things in themselves, end quote, that can never be known to science. Marxist philosophical materialism holds that the world and its laws are fully knowable, that our knowledge of the laws of nature, tested by experiment and practice, is authentic knowledge in the world, is authentic knowledge having the validity of objective truth, and that there are no things in the world which are unknowable, but only things which are still not known, but which will be disclosed and made known by the efforts of science and practice, end quote. Stalin. Critical support for these claims is held to be found on the one hand in the, quote, copy theory propounded by Engels and further extended by Lenin, and on the other in an appeal to the confirmation of knowledge by practice. We have already had frequent occasion to observe that dialectical materialism is firmly committed to a realist point of view. In consequence of this, it is energetic in campaigning not only against skepticism, Protagoras, Gorgias, Pyrrho, and among modern philosophers, above all Hume, but also against any form of agnosticism. Under the catchword of, quote, agnosticism, the attack of Soviet science is chiefly directed upon Kant, Spencer, Comte, Dubois Raymond, together with Helmholtz as the originator of the, quote, hieroglyphic theory, end quote. Heisenberg's uncertainty relation is likewise rejected as agnosticism. Besides skepticism and agnosticism, Soviet theory of knowledge is also particularly averse to the various forms of subjective and objective idealism. Though Hegel certainly admits that the world is knowable, he is still considered to have a mistaken conception of knowledge. Though Hegel certainly admits that the world is knowable, Hegel is still considered to have a mistaken conception of knowledge, in that Hegel views knowledge not as a reflection of the outer world arising from interaction between man and nature, but as the outcome of the self-development and self-knowledge of the absolute idea. The correctness of our knowledge of reality is guaranteed for Hegel by the identity of knowledge with its object. And lastly, dialectical materialism is also naturally opposed to any sort of irrationalism or intuitionism as involving the denial of our knowledge of reality in its most extreme form. Pre-Marxian materialism is given credit for having always held firmly to the view that the external world is knowable and reflected in human consciousness, but it conceived of knowledge as a passive contemplation of reality, a purely mechanical reflection of the latter in consciousness. It had not yet grasped the whole complicated process of knowledge, nor did it ever progress to the point of applying the dialectic to this process. Against all such defective theories of knowledge, dialectical materialism advances its own copy theory. According to this, our representations and concepts arise through the operations of the external world upon our sense organs. They depict or, quote, mirror the world outside. The first assertion is directed against idealism. Representations and concepts are not produced by the subject. The second has particular reference to the hieroglyphic theory. Representations and concepts are not just signs or symbols, having no inner resemblance to the objects known thereby, but are, quote, pictures, quote, mirror images, quote, copies of the objects so known, and therefore resemble them. This reflection of reality in consciousness is not to be thought of, however, as a momentary act, like the process which gives rise to the dead, immobile imagery of a photograph. Just as the world is a process of development, so knowledge too must be viewed as a process in which we move from a state of, quote, ignorance to one of, quote, knowing, and in which there is a parallel transformation of, quote, things in themselves, and, quote, into, quote, things for us. Yesterday we did not know that coal tar contains alizarin. Today we do know this. Nevertheless, there can be no doubt that coal tar also contains alizarin yesterday, when we were still unaware of the fact. Lenin concludes from this, quote, 1. Things exist independently of our consciousness independently of our perceptions outside of us, ... 2. There is definitely no difference in principle between the phenomenon and the thing in itself, ... The only difference is that between what is known and what is not yet known, ... 3. In the theory of knowledge, as in every other branch of science, we must think dialectically. That is, we must not regard our knowledge as ready-made and unalterable, but must determine how knowledge emerges from ignorance, how incomplete, inexact knowledge becomes more complete and more exact, end quote. Lenin. But if knowledge is therefore to be regarded as a dialectical process, it also has to be seen as a conflict of opposites and as involving, quote, contradictions. The, quote, contradictory aspect of the knowing process lies mainly in the inexhaustible and unlimited character of the world to be known and the limitations of human knowledge at every concrete historical stage of its development. In his philosophical notebooks, Lenin dwells repeatedly on this dialectical, quote, contradictory character of the knowing process. Where am I? Sorry. But if knowledge is therefore to be regarded as a dialectical process, it also has to be seen as a conflict of opposites and is involving, quote, contradictions. The, quote, contradictory aspect of the knowing process lies mainly in the inexhaustible and unlimited character of the world to be known and the limitations of human knowledge at every concrete historical stage of its development. In his philosophical notebooks, Lenin dwells repeatedly on this dialectical, quote, contradictory character of the knowing process. Quote, the reflection of nature and human thought must be envisaged, not as, quote, dead or, quote, abstract or static or free from contradiction, but as an eternal process of movement in which contradictions are forever emerging and being resolved, end quote. Lenin. Two dialectical transitions in particular are acknowledged by Soviet dialectical materialism within the process of knowledge. One leads from matter to consciousness and occurs in sensation. The other takes place in the formation of abstract concepts from sensations and representations. Thereby distinguishing two phases in the knowing process, dialectical materialism endeavors to avoid the extremes of one-sided sensationalism and an equally one-sided rationalism. The rationalists, such as Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz, thought it possible to attain knowledge of the world by speculative methods alone, without regard for sense experience. At the same time, they also postulated certain innate ideas. The sensationalists, on the other hand, Hobbes, Locke, Condillac, Feuerbach, regarded sense perception as the only source of knowledge. Nihil est in intellectu quod non prius fuerit in sensu. Locke. They underestimated the part played by theoretical thinking and overlooked the fact that the transition from sense perception to thought represents a qualitative leap. Avoiding each of these one-sided views, Marxist philosophical materialism looks upon both types of knowledge as an essential stage in the knowing process. Quote, from living intuition to abstract thought, and from thence to practice, that is the dialectical road to knowledge of the truth, to knowledge of objective reality, end quote. So far as the first stage is concerned, Lenin, as we have already seen, defines sensation as, quote, the transformation of the energy of external excitation into a state of consciousness, end quote. Lenin. But how this transition from physical to mental occurs in the concrete dialectic of materialism never actually informs us. Kashkachik admits that, quote, the mechanism of this change has not as yet been sufficiently investigated, end quote. But very thorough attention is given instead to another question, namely how the sensation is related to that which is represented through it, i.e. whether or not the sensation resembles its object. That is the celebrated problem as to the objectivity of sense qualities. The dialectical materialist attitude to this problem is not particularly clear, but there is sufficient evidence of a general tendency to answer this question along the lines of a critical realism, attributing to specific sensations an objectivity that is not formal, but merely causal in character. Yet a number of formulations given by various authors often appear to go further than this, ascribing them a formal objectivity as well. In order to take stock of the Soviet philosophical position and the various ways in which it has been formulated, we need to be acquainted with the views attacked by dialectical materialism. Whatever the esteem accorded to Democritus as a pioneer of materialism in antiquity, there is a clear divergence from Democritus's doctrine that sense qualities, color, smell, etc., do not belong to material things and hence are not exact copies of them. Locke's distinction between the primary size, shape, number, motion, and rest, and secondary qualities of bodies, color, sound, smell, and taste, is rejected because he regards the secondary qualities as subjective, as not characterizing material things as such, and thereby makes a palpable concession to idealism, end quote. F.I. Kashkachik. The mechanists, too, are accused of holding that color, smell, etc. only exist subjectively for the sensing subject alone, that a rose is red, for example, only so long as someone is observing it. Thus, the mechanist Sorobanov developed the theory that which exists in consciousness as a determinate quality, color, sound, etc., is present outside consciousness as a merely quantitative determination. On this view, characteristics such as, quote, hard, quote, red, quote, bitter, etc., would be merely, quote, our sensations and nothing more, end quote. But dialectical materialism is particularly averse to, quote, physiological idealism, end quote. The theory that sensations, colors, smell, sound, etc. are wholly and solely dependent on the physiological organization of the perceiving subject. Exponents of this doctrine include the German physiologist Johannes Müller, who lived from 1801 to 1858, who held that the qualities of our sensations are determined not by the qualities of the material stimulus, but solely by the specific structure of our sensory nerves and sense organs. The same is true of his pupil Hilmar Helmholtz, who lived from 1821 to 1894, who likewise regarded the quality of color and sound sensations as exclusively dependent on the specific energy of the optic or auditory nerves. In Helmholtz's view, the qualities of our sensations bear no resemblance to the properties of external objects. The differences between the sensations conveyed by the various sense organs are entirely governed by the nature of the nerves involved, not by the character of the external stimulus. On the strength of these considerations, Helmholtz worked out his theory of symbols, according to which our sensations are merely signs or symbols for external objects, and do not represent them. Every individual has to master these symbols through experience and the use of language, just as he has learnt to understand his mother tongue. This theory of Helmholtz's later provided Plekhanov with the basis of his, quote, hieroglyphic theory, unquote. In a note to the first edition of his translation of Engel's Ludwig Feuerbach of 1892, Plekhanov writes as follows, his authority being the Russian physiologist Sechenov, quote, our sensations are a sort of hieroglyphics which render us conscious of what is going on in reality. The hieroglyphics bear no resemblance to the occurrences mediated by them, end quote. Plekhanov. From the hostility evinced by dialectical materialism towards all these theories, it would appear that it is not content with a purely causal objectivity of sense qualities, an objectivity that is in the sense merely that sense qualities are evoked by certain properties and objects, but do not in themselves resemble these properties. But, nor, on the other hand, is there any willingness to ascribe a formal objectivity to these qualities, in the sense that the properties exist in the sense organs in the same manner as they do in the object. This can be seen from the critical attitude taken by dialectical materialism towards the, quote, naive realists, end quote, who hold that color, smell, sound, taste, etc. are objective properties of material things in the sense that they exist there exactly as we perceive them. It also emerges from the disavowal of, quote, vulgar materialism, end quote, which regards sensation as a simple mechanical reproduction of the object in the brain and suppose the existence and nature of, quote, colors in themselves, and quote, sounds in themselves, and quote, etc., which are reflected in the corresponding sensations we have of them. The positive doctrine of dialectical materialism is summed up in the following 2 points. 1. Color, sound, smell, etc. exist as objective properties of material things, independent of man's consciousness and his sense organs. 2. Our sense impressions are truthful reflections of these objective properties in material things. Particular reliance is placed at this point on a passage from Lenin's Materialism and Empirio-criticism. Quote, the sensation of red reflects ether vibrations of a frequency of approximately 450 trillions per second. The sensation of blue reflects ether vibrations of a frequency of approximately 620 trillions per second. The vibrations of the ether exist independently of our sensations of light. Our sensations of light depend on the action of the vibrations of the ether on the human organ of vision. Our sensations reflect objective reality, i.e. something that exists independently of humanity and of human sensations. That is how science views it, end quote. Lenin. What corresponds in objective reality to the sensation of, quote, red, therefore, is either vibrations of a certain frequency, is ether vibrations of a certain frequency, but how there can be any resemblance between these two phenomena is not easy to see, nor do the commentaries of the Soviet philosophers do anything to clarify matters. Reference is made, for example, to the fact that sensations are supposed to be subjective in form but objective in content. Quote, human sensations are subjective as regards their form. Their subjectivity consists in the fact that they exist only in our consciousness, but are objective in respect of their content, their origin, their source, end quote. F.I. Hatchik. Leonov again appeals to the almighty contradiction to resolve the difficulty. Quote, the resemblance between reflection and object is not a simple mechanical similarity, but a complex contradictory resemblance. The sensory material, the living organism, reflects the operation of external objects and processes in its own fashion, on the basis of its own particular properties, the inner laws of its nature. End quote. Leonov. Mitten speaks of a, quote, relative resemblance. Quote, the objective quality of the light wave is reflected here in subjective form, in the form of sensation. The color resembles the objective process consisting in the action of light which produces it, but only in a relative fashion, end quote. The point which is supposed to be brought out in all these groping attempts to define the relation between the sensation and the property of the object thereby reproduces doubtless the notion that something more than a causal relationship obtains between the two, that sense impressions somehow reproduce objective properties in bodies, even though there is no formal resemblance between them. The transition from matter to sensation constitutes the first dialectical, quote, leap in the knowing process. The second consists in the transition from sensory knowledge, sensation, perception, representation, to the abstract logical concept. For knowledge must be regarded not as a passive immediate reflection of reality, but as a process in which the knowing subject takes an active part, ascending by abstraction from sensations to higher products of knowledge. In other words, as a process occurring by stages. Quote, knowledge, says Lenin, quote, is the reflection of nature on the part of man. This reflection, however, is by no means a simple, immediate, total affair, but rather a process involving a series of abstractions, formulations, the framing of concepts, laws, etc. End quote. Lenin. Sense perception merely reflects appearance. Admittedly, the general aspects of things, their interconnectedness also finds expression in the process. but it is only an outer generality, an outer connectedness. Parenthesis, the presence of a common color, for example, or the sequence of sound following upon a blow, and so on, in parenthesis. Sense perception fails, however, to grasp the relationships and laws involved, the element of causal connection. This is the work of logical knowledge, which penetrates into the essence of things, seeking out the inner unity behind the outward resemblance. For this reason, it constitutes an indispensable element in the development of human knowledge. This transition to logical knowledge, from the reflection of appearance to the reflection of essence, also has a dialectical character. For logical thought would certainly seem to lead us to some extent away from concrete things. Sense perception is much closer to things, for it expresses things in all their concreteness and with all their individual features. But in place of this, logical knowledge goes deeper than sensation, for it probes the essence of the thing. Quote, the movement of knowledge towards knowledge's object must always take place in dialectical fashion, withdrawing in order to grasp it more securely. Reculer pour mieux sauter. ... End quote. Lenin. Quote, in ascending from the concrete to the abstract, thought, provided it is correct, does not get farther away from truth, but comes closer to truth. ... All scientific ... abstractions present a deeper, more faithful, more complete reflection of nature. End quote. Only logical knowledge can grasp an occurrence in its entirety. Quote, representation cannot grasp motion in motion's entirety. Thus, representation cannot grasp motion at a speed of 186,000 miles per second, but thought can grasp it and is obliged to do so. End quote. Lenin. And the ascent from concrete appearance to general essence takes place by way of abstraction or, quote, generalization. Individual objects of the same kind are initially distinct from one another, no one of them being exactly like the others in every respect. But nor, on the other hand, is there any one which does not have much in common with the remainder. Quote, the general exists only in the singular, and through the singular, every singular is, in one way or another, a general. End quote. Lenin. Now, the task of logical knowledge is precisely that of discovering this general in the singular, of extracting the essential from the mass of accidental particulars. Thus, logical generalizations also provide subjective pictures of the objective world, just as sense perceptions do, but unlike sense perceptions, they are mediated reflections of reality. They are concepts, giving expression to the general and essential features of things. Sensory and rational, or as the Soviet philosophers call it, logical, knowledge form in this way a unity, a single knowing process in two stages. The cleavage made by empiricism and rationalism, each in its own fashion between sensation and concept, is thereby bridged. The dialectical materialist recognition of the dialectical unity of sensation and concept is held to overcome the one-sidedness of both these views. Mitten goes on from this to dispose of an objection raised against Lenin's copy theory by L. Axelrod, that to regard sensations as images, pictures, or, quote, copies of things must lead to a new separation of subject and object, which would make things as such superfluous and turn them once more into genuine, quote, things in themselves. Mitten rejects this argument of Axelrod's on the ground that it overlooks the dialectical character of the copy theory. It is precisely in virtue of the dialectical connection thereby established within the knowing process that sensations do not separate us off from things, as Kant thought, but bring us into union with them. But this does not suffice on the copy theory to furnish all the essential ingredients of the knowing process. For this latter, which begins with sensation and advances to dialectical thought, completes itself. Quote, on the basis of the development of socio-historical practice, which emerges in the class society as the practice of a particular class, end quote. F.I. Kaskachik. Material reality is perfectly reflected only in social consciousness. Hence the knowing subject, and this, according to dialectical materialism, constitutes the fundamental error of traditional epistemology, must be convinced not in an abstract idealist fashion as, quote, consciousness, quote, soul, or, quote, thought, as a logical or psychological, quote, subject, nor yet in the abstract materialist manner as, quote, man as such, end quote, in his natural and immediate givenness, but rather as man, the socially active being, the representative of a particular social class. New section, Section 3. Practice is the foundation of knowledge and criterion of truth. M.N. Rutkevich sums up the role of practice in the knowing process under the following heads. Firstly, it is the foundation of knowledge, and secondly, it also serves as the criterion of truth. The first thing is to make clear that the Soviet philosophers mean by quote, practice. Rutkevich, in a polemic against other Soviet viewpoints, describes it as the, quote, material activity of man, end quote, a definition directed particularly against those who also want to include under it theoretical and intellectual activity. By, quote, material activity of man, end quote, he means above all the production of material goods, but also the class struggle, political life, and even the physical and material procedures involved in scientific or artistic activity. Kaskachik gives a similar interpretation of the term. The Soviet philosophers commonly base their philosophy of the role of practice in the knowing process on a passage from Lenin's philosophical notebooks. Quote, from living intuition to abstract thought, and from thence to practice, that is the dialectical road to knowledge of the truth, to knowledge of objective reality, end quote. Lenin, philosophical notebooks. But Rutkevich emphasizes that this observation of Lenin's does not mean that practice merely comes in as the, quote, third stage in the knowing process, or that the first two stages referred to by Lenin are not bound up with practice. Quote, practice is the foundation of the entire knowing process. The foundation of the entire knowing process, from beginning to end, end quote. M.N. Rutkevich. Rutkevich sees the basis of this thesis in the social character of human thought. Quote, unlike metaphysical materialism, dialectical materialism views the individual act of thought in any one of the innumerable human heads as a particle of the historical process of knowledge embracing the world as a whole, in which this particle is organically incorporated, end quote. Our thinking is not, therefore, that of an isolated individual, and since our knowing is a socio-historical process, it is also conditioned by the development of social practice. In the first place, even our powers of sensory perception are dependent on this historical practice. Here, Rutkevich appeals to Marx as having maintained that the development of the five senses is a product of the whole of world history. The physiological delicacy of the sensations received by eye, ear, hand, etc. develops in accordance with the progress of production and culture. The same holds true of intellectual knowledge. Thanks to this theory of socio-historical practice as the foundation of knowledge, Marxism, according to Rutkevich, is in a position to resolve the eternal quarrel between rationalism and sensationalism about, quote, innate ideas, and quote, certain propositions such as those of mathematics owe their axiomatic character to the fact that, parallel with the development of socio-historical practice, the capacity for thought also progressed along with its content, quote, which found expression in the hereditary fixation of the peculiar properties of the physiological structure of the brain and nervous system, and in the further modification of this heredity, end quote. The, quote, invisible presence, end quote, of practice in the pursuit of theoretical thinking is also shown by the fact that at every step in the formation of a theory, we test the results of our thought against the facts, even the laws of logic indeed, by whose aid concepts are incorporated into a system have developed alongside the development of man's practical activity. The second task to practice in the knowing process is that of functioning as the criterion of truth. Dialectical materialism starts by rejecting a number of, quote, idealist criteria. Descartes', quote, clear and distinct ideas, end quote. Hegel's identity of knowledge with knowledge as object, premising as it does that this is really an identity of knowledge, which itself, with knowledge itself, since object and knowledge are one and the same. Mach's principle of intellectual economy, and Bogdanov's thesis that the true is that which has, quote, universal significance, end quote. Pre-Marxian materialism, too, though correct in its conception of truth as the correspondence of thought with reality, failed, however, to carry this forward into regarding practice as the criterion of truth, because it was oriented exclusively upon contemplative apprehension of the world and not upon the struggle to change it. Marx was the first to rectify this basic fallacy of knowledge in all previous philosophy when he laid down his theses on Feuerbach, quote, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it, end quote. Marx. This statement also pointed the way in a logical sense to the discovery of practice as the criterion of truth. Starting from this basis, Marx then postulates as much in his second thesis, quote, the question of whether objective truth can be attributed to human thinking is not a question of theory, but is a practical question. In practice, man must prove the truth, that is, the reality and power, this sidedness of his thinking. The dispute over the reality or non-reality of thinking, which is isolated from practice, is a purely scholastic question, end quote. Marx. Engels, in his Ludwig Feuerbach, endeavors to reinforce this thesis by appealing to experiment and industry in which human foresight finds its confirmation in practice and thereby gives proof both of the base power of human knowledge over reality and at the same time of the falsity of the Kantian belief in an essentially ungraspable, quote, thing in itself, end quote. Quote, the most telling refutation of this, as of all other philosophical crotchets, is practice, namely experiment and industry. If we are able to prove the correctness of our conception of a natural process by making it ourselves, bringing it into being out of its conditions and making it serve our own purposes into the bargain, then there is an end to the Kantian ungraspable, quote, thing in itself, end quote. The chemical substances produced in the bodies of plants and animals remain such, quote, things in themselves, end quote, until organic chemistry began to produce them one after another, whereupon the, quote, thing in itself, end quote, became a thing for us, as for instance, alizarin, the coloring matter of the matter, madder, which we no longer trouble to grow in the madder roots in the field, but produce much more cheaply and simply from coal tar. For 300 years, the Copernican solar system was a hypothesis with 100, 1,000, or 10,000 chances to 1 in its favor, but still always a hypothesis. But when Leverrier, by means of the data provided by this system, not only deduced the necessity of the existence of an unknown planet, but also calculated the position in the heavens which this planet must necessarily occupy, and when Galle, or Galle, really found this planet, the Copernican system was proved, end quote. Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach. This argument of Engels met with severe criticism, it being pointed out that Engels had completely failed to understand Kant. Plekhanov attempts to shield him against this objection and defend the correctness of his reasoning. Since the appearance of Kant is merely an outcome of the impression made on me by the thing in itself, the fact is that in experiment and industry I am compelling the thing in itself to affect me in a given fashion intended by myself. And from this it follows that I have at least a certain knowledge of some of its properties. A second argument adduced by Plekhanov is better than the first. In experimental and industrial activity, I compel the thing to affect me in a particular fashion. That is, I take up an active attitude towards it as a cause. But according to Kant, the category of causality has no validity outside the phenomenal order, and has no application to the thing in itself. Quote, experiment refutes him. Kant, even better than he refutes himself, when he says that the category of causality relates to appearances, not things in themselves, and at the same time maintains that the, quote, thing in itself, and, quote, acts upon our, quote, self, i.e. the cause of appearances, end quote. These considerations of Plekhanos represent at best a justification of Engels' argument against the Kantians. They fail, however, to provide any positive basis for the doctrine of practice as the criterion of true knowledge, nor do they show to what extent practice contains the solution to the problem of knowledge. As Losky remarks in passing, even if confirmation in practical activity does actually give us the assurance that we are capable of authentic knowledge of the world, this is nothing to solve the epistemological problem. We still lack a theory of knowledge proper, whose task is to demonstrate the critical and ontological possibility, parenthesis, quote, the conditions of the possibility, and, quote, as Kant would say, in parenthesis, as to how the subject may have true knowledge, not only of his own experiences and acts of cognition, but also of the outside world independent of his knowledge. Rutkiewicz emphasizes, furthermore, that confirmation by practice should not be taken to suggest that only propositions confirmed by experiment can advance any claim to truth. Marxism does not reduce practice to experiment. There's a footnote that I missed. G.V. Plekhanov, in his notes to the second Russian edition of Engels' Ludwig Feuerbach of 1905, this argument appears unconvincing, for Kant would never allow that in experiment industry the subject compels the thing in itself to impress itself on him, quote, in a given fashion, end quote. The impressions produced by the thing in itself are for Kant an amorphous mass. All determination arises through the application to this amorphous mass of the a priori forms of the knowing subject. End footnote. There are also observations in astronomy, for instance, where no sort of experimental verification is possible, hence the significance of experiment should not be overrated. Quote, practice includes both experiment and observation, but the decisive role in the process is played by labor and the political activity of the masses, production, and the class struggle. End quote. Rutkiewicz. Another author goes further still and credits revolutionary practice with an even more decisive significance in the process of cognition. Quote, the Marxist-Leninist epistemology has no other aim beyond the service of revolutionary practice, end quote. F.I. Georgiev. In connection with this dialectical materialist doctrine of practice as the criterion of truth, and more especially in consequence of the aforementioned text from Lenin's philosophical notebooks, quote, from living intuition to abstract thought and from thence to practice, ... end quote. A discussion has lately arisen among the Soviet philosophers as to whether practice must be incorporated as a, quote, third stage, end quote, in the knowing process. Rutkiewicz definitely rejects this view. In an article in Vопроsi Philosophy, on the ground that it involves a twofold error, A, practice is thereby shifted into the sphere of knowing, and B, if practice figures merely as a, quote, third stage in the knowing process, it ceases to be the foundation of the other two. This opinion was specifically contested in another contribution to the discussion by V.M. Podestnik. Further essays on the same theme were published together with an editorial postscript. In the first number of the 1955 volume of Vопроsi Philosophy, the outcome of the discussion, as laid down by the editors in their postscript, constitute a rejection of Rutkiewicz's thesis. He was chided for having incorrectly set practice in opposition to intellectual activity. Quote, only if knowledge is regarded as a purely intellectual process, having no extension beyond the boundaries of pure consciousness, it is possible to speak of a false incorporation of practice into the sphere of knowledge. But the situation is entirely different from this. It is only because Marxism has thrown down the barriers erected between knowledge and practice by the older philosophers, and boldly carried practice into the sphere of knowledge, that it has been able to effect a transformation in the field of epistemology itself, and to create a truly scientific theory of knowledge." End quote. The editors of Vопроsi Philosophy. Practice is assuredly the foundation of the knowing process as a whole, and of each individual stage therein, inasmuch as both living intuition and the abstractive activity of thought are carried out under its decisive influence. But neither the first nor the second stage are capable in themselves of yielding reliable knowledge if it is not confirmed in practice. Rutkiewicz also shows signs of an excessive separation of knowledge and practice, in that he only reckons art and science under practice insofar as they involve physical or material procedures. But in spite of this criticism, Rutkiewicz's book, titled "Practice as the Foundation of Knowledge and Criterion of Truth," still largely retains its authority, as is shown by the fact that in the summer of 1957, the Dietz Press in East Berlin brought out a German translation praising it in its announcements as follows, quote, "This book has caused a sensation among philosophers. ... The philosophically minded German reader will be rewarded on reading it, ... with important philosophical insights," end quote. New section: Objective, Relative, and Absolute Truth. In conjunction with the copy theory, Soviet philosophy normally goes on to deal with the question of objective truth. Lenin already regards these two problems as internally linked with one another. Quote, "To regard our sensations as images of the external world, to recognize objective truth, to hold the materialist theory of knowledge, these are all one and the same thing," end quote. Lenin's occasion for enlarging on this theme was provided by Bogdanov, who had maintained in his book An Empirio-Monism that, quote, "As I understand it, Marxism contains a denial of the unconditional objectivity of any truth whatsoever, the denial of all eternal truths," end quote. Bogdanov. As we have already seen in dealing with this author, the objectivity of a physical phenomenon consists, in his view, in nothing else except its universal validity. Soviet dialectical materialists also found opponents in the ranks of the mechanists. Serab Yanov, for example, held that, quote, "Objective truth has no sort of existence. All truth is subjective." End quote. And he goes on to explain this as follows, quote, "Why do I call all truth subjective? For this reason, because truth is not objective being, because truth is our representation of the world, of things and of processes," end quote. In company with Lenin, Rutkiewicz takes objective truth to be, quote, "the content of human thought as tested in practice, which is in conformity with objects and is thus independent of the subject, man, and humanity in general," end quote. Rutkiewicz. This objective truth is discovered in the course of the historical development undergone by the knowledge of social man. It is not a static dead affair, but a process. Quote, "Truth is a process," end quote, says Lenin, commenting on the Hegelian theory that in its own nature the idea is itself a process. Quote, "Man advances from subjective idea to objective truth by way of," quote, "practice and technology," end quote. Lenin. But if objective truth has the character of a process, and if our own knowledge therefore has a similar character, it follows from this that a distinction must also be drawn within objective truth itself, between absolute and relative truth, On the one hand, acknowledgement of objective truth also requires the admission of absolute truth. Quote, to acknowledge objective truth, i.e. truth not dependent on man and mankind, is in one way or another to recognize absolute truth. End quote. Lenin. Absolute truth is nothing other than the full range and extent of objective truth. But man is incapable of grasping the full extent of this absolute truth in one and the same instant. Man can only come increasingly close to it and arrive there by gradual stages. Quote, man is unable to grasp, reflect, copy nature as a whole, a complete thing in its, quote, immediate totality, end quote. He can only approach eternally closer to it, by creating abstractions, concepts, laws, a scientific world picture, and so on and so forth. End quote. This progressive conquest of absolute truth is relative truth. Quote, human thought then by its nature is capable of giving and does give absolute truth, which is compounded of a sum total of relative truths, end quote. Lenin. Absolute truth is the sum of relative truths. Quote, absolute truth stands to relative as whole to part. End quote. F.I. Kachik. But since the world is infinite and human knowledge likewise an endlessly advancing process, it follows that absolute truth will never be attained by mankind. The conclusion is in fact drawn on many occasions by Soviet authors. Quote, this process of approximation to absolute truth, i.e. to an exhaustive knowledge about the world, is an unending process which will never reach its full conclusion, end quote. Engels had already spoken in this connection of a, quote, asymptomatic asymptomatic progress, unquote. In spite of this, however, the de Boerists were attacked in their day when they openly admitted as much and so declared absolute truth to be a thing unattainable. For de Boer, quote, every given truth represents a relative, not an absolute truth, ... Absolute truth itself, on the other hand, is something we never possess. We merely approach absolute truth continuously in our consciousness and in our activity, end quote. A.M. de Boer. In opposition to this de Boerist formula, Leninist dialectical materialism puts forward another, namely that absolute truth is attained in the relative. Quote, for objective dialectics, there is an absolute even within the relative. For subjectivism and sophistry, the relative is only relative and excludes the absolute, end quote. Lenin. Thus it is that the Soviet philosophers interpret absolute truth to consist in, quote, an absolutely exact agreement with thought with its object, i.e. a content of our knowledge, such that neither now nor in the future, in consequence of the further development of knowledge, can it ever be proved false. End quote. M.N. Rutkevich. Relative truth is thereupon taken to represent, quote, a moment or stage in the knowledge of absolute truth. End quote. F.I. Kaskachik. So hard to say. This relativity does not imply any mutability in the object of knowledge, such that it might be so today and otherwise 100 years hence, and thereby involve a change in our knowledge of this object. It indicates rather, quote, that the given concrete historical state of a phenomenon is reflected in man's consciousness with approximate relative accuracy up to a certain degree of depth, end quote. M.N. Rutkevich. Rutkevich also provides some examples of such, quote, absolute truths, end quote. Quote, all the fundamental theses and an enormous number of lesser tenets of Marxist-Leninist philosophy, economic science, and the theory of socialism and the class struggle are absolutely true. That matter is primary and consciousness derivative, that the collapse of capitalism is inevitable, that the, quote, socialist system will follow capitalism as inevitably as day follows night, end quote. That the socialist economic system offers unlimited scope for the development of productive forces, etc. These are all absolute truths. All absolute truths, so far confirmed by practice that nothing in the future can ever refute them, end quote. M.N. Rutkevich. As has frequently been stressed already, the positive value of the copy theory lies precisely in the emphatic realism of its point of view. It is also a great point in favor of this theory, especially the Leninist version of it, that again, in striking contrast to the sensationalist opinions of earlier materialists, it insists throughout the working out of the knowledge of the, quote, dialectical transition from sensory to the, quote, logical stages of knowledge, on preserving an essential distinction between the two, and thereby acknowledges the basic impossibility of assimilating intellectual cognition to sensory activity. To be sure, the copy theory itself still offers no sort of critical vindication of the real authenticity of human knowledge, nor does the copy theory ever get beyond the assertion of a naively realistic point of view. Footnote. It is possibly of interest in this connection to point out that in Soviet philosophical usage, the expression, quote, naive realism has a very peculiar meaning. We have already seen earlier that Kask-Hatchik applies the term, quote, naive realism to that conception of the objectivity of sense qualities, whereby the latter are held to be located formally in things in the same manner as they are perceived by the sense organs. But Mitten describes Marxism as, quote, naive realism, end quote, because it identifies the objective world with our sensations. End footnote. As we saw above, a critical vindication of this kind is supposedly effected by the appeal to practice and by proclamation of the dialectical unity of theory, knowledge, and thought, and practice, whose concrete embodiment is the economic process of production, but such a justification fails to stand up to detailed criticism. Granted that the epistemological inquiry cannot be initiated on a basis of universal doubt, the theory of knowledge of Soviet dialectical materialism still presupposes too many premises that stand in need of prior justification or proof, for it to be able to rank as a genuine critique of knowledge. Thus, from the very outset, it not only takes for granted the presence of an external world, independent of the knowing subject, but also makes use of other derivative theses which should themselves have been the product of extensive preliminary inquiry, such as the validity of historical knowledge, which is assumed as self-evident by the historicism implicit in the dialectical materialist epistemology. Indeed, the much contested thesis of the materialist conception of history, which already belongs to the philosophy of history, is itself a premise of this epistemology. For the, quote, dialectical unity, end quote, of theory and practice is intelligible only on the basis of the materialist conception of history, whereby intellectual activity is construed as a function of economic practice. As for the theory of practice as the criterion of truth, it commits the logical fallacy of tacitly assuming the point to be proved. For confirmation in practice in the shape of an experimental proof, for example, is also supposed to warrant the validity of our sensory knowledge. But again, the positive or negative outcome of the experiment cannot be perceived except by sensory awareness. It is in any case impossible to derive the validity of the major principles of thought from confirmation in practice, i.e. from experience. As we have seen, dialectical materialism deduces the validity even of mathematical axioms and logical principles from their confirmation in the practice of earlier generations and inheritance of the brain structure thereby brought about. But inheritance can at best do no more than account for the presence of psychological necessities of thought, not for insight into the truth and logical necessity of the propositions in question. Experience gives rise to necessary general propositions, not through mere piling up of experience itself, but by way of induction, This, however, already presupposes the validity of the primary laws of thought, notably the principle of sufficient reason. Finally, we must ask, and more particularly in regard to the absolute validity of the various social laws allegedly, quote, proved by social practice, how long a social doctrine has to maintain itself before it can claim the rank of a, quote, absolute truth. For we have seen in our own day how particular social theories and movements may succeed for a time and accomplish themselves and eventually lead to catastrophe. Take National Socialism, for example, which certainly met with very great success. It began with in both internal and external affairs, but ultimately led to a fearful disaster. One may equally suppose, indeed, that communism will pursue a similar course, save only that it displays a somewhat greater historical, quote, wavelength, and will therefore take longer before it falls into the trough. And that is the end of Chapter 6 of Part 2 of Gustav A. Vetter's Dialectical Materialism, a Historical and Systematic Survey. I think this is video 17 of the book out of 18. I'm not sure. Yeah, this is 17. Thank you so much for listening.